we are absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to this program that I have been planning as a group activity for the department here for some time. And it is also indeed a very, very great pleasure to host two very, very eminent speakers today to celebrate the poetry of Louise Elizabeth Glück. Professor Nishat Haider from Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and Professor Himadri Roy from IGNOU, New Delhi. So, as a formal beginning, I would like to welcome all the speakers, all the participants, dear students, on behalf of the Department of English Studies at Akal University to this program, where we are celebrating the 2020 Nobel Prize that was awarded to Louise Glück. Professor Gluck was born in New York City in 1943 and grew up in New York, Long Island, and thereafter went to university at Columbia University, where she later joined in the faculty. She is regarded to be one of United States' most talented contemporary poets and is known for her technical precision, sensitivity, insights into loneliness, relationships, death, and myriad other themes. The poet Robert Hass has called her one of the most purest and most accomplished lyric poets writing currently. So the award for the Nobel Prize in Literature comes after 2 years of intense cribbing and positioning and politicking by the Nobel Committee. And we were all looking forward to a great Nobel Prize this time. And we have not been disappointed because the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to her by the Nobel Committee for her unmistakable poetic voice that, with austere beauty, makes individual existence a universal theme. So with these words, I would like to invite Dr. Anil Kumar P., who is the moderator of today's program. And before that, I just formally welcome again Professor Nishat Haider and Professor Himadri Roy for their invaluable time, spending their invaluable time to spend with us. So we're looking forward to all your interactions, and we have a set of poetry to be read out by some students and some faculty members. So we're looking forward. Dr. Anil, can you take over, please?
Good afternoon. It's absolutely a great pleasure. It's not a stereotypical expression where you hear that somebody says that it is a great pleasure seeing such luminaries. I indeed mean what I say. I've heard about these professors, both of you, as professors of great repute. I haven't been able to see both of you, meet both of you at any time in my life. So it's certainly a pleasure. So this is one session worth having, in the sense that we have a Nobel laureate who has been honored, though late, and any award like a Nobel Prize is not something that really defines her as far as I understand her. So at the end of the day, uh, she has been someone whose contribution to American poetry or the world literature has been so monumental, in the sense that, as far as I understand, she has traversed a parallel world when there existed a world of great luminaries, both as her predecessors and contemporaries. And there is hardly anybody else that I can see who has created an alternate or a parallel world to traverse. And to celebrate such a great personality is something the least that we are doing, as a matter of fact. So it's my great pleasure. There are lots of participants here who would read out their pieces of poems, and we are also eagerly looking forward to the insights of both the professors and some participation from the student team as well. So I'm happy that I could moderate this. It's a big job indeed. Thank you.
Should I begin, Shantanu? Professor Shantanu?
Yes, I think it will be very great if you can begin right now.
Thank you so much, Professor Shantanu, and the faculty and the students and Dr. Roy and everyone who's here. And it was a very short notice, but so you'll have to bear with me. And I would like to begin with a little, snippet from an interview. Uh, in a 2009 interview with Louise Glück, her fellow poet Dana Levin, she observes, and here I quote, "I have a student right now who likes to talk about entry fees, you know. How much does it cost to enter this poem?" And he recently said to me,
Screen.
the entry fee for a Louise Glück poem is like $1. But once you get in, the territory is complex, unquote. So in the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, it can be very difficult indeed, as Reena Sastry says, to recognize the complexity of a poem whose entry fee is low, that is, whose metalinguistic and metafictional reflexivity emerges through spare, deceptively plain language, and whose philosophical curiosity resides in the company of psychological insight and emotional immediacy. Now, while the critics and scholars may disagree on how to interpret Louise Elizabeth Glück's work, but there is a growing consensus that she is a major voice in contemporary American poetry. Now born in New York City in 1943 and raised on Long Island, she is the author of 14 books of poetry, including the recent collections Faithful and Virtuous Night, which was the winner of the National Book Award, and Poems 1962-2012, which was published in the year 2012. And in addition to poetry, Glück has published 2 major volumes of poetic criticism, Proofs and Theories, Essays on Poetry, 1994, and American Originality, Essays on Poetry, 2017. Born to parents of British heritage, Glück, in her essay, Education of the Poet, observes that her parents promoted learning and education for her and her sister. She had an older sister who passed away before Glück was born. And Glück states, I quote, my parents admired intellectual accomplishment. My mother, in particular, revered creative gifts. And she says further that she was very well grounded in Greek mythology by the age of 3, and that she owes it to her mother. So these experiences, that is losing an older sister and the knowledge of Greek myths, would come to deeply inform Glück's poetry. there's another very important fact that we need to remember, and that is the influence of psychoanalysis. And it so happened that as a teenager, Gluck had developed anorexia nervosa. And as a result of her condition, she did not enroll in college as a full-time student, as she had to undergo therapy. And all those sessions of psychoanalysis left a deep imprint on her mind. And how does it take place? I'll come to it later in a bit. But first things first, Gluck's university level studies in poetry began at Sarah Lawrence College and the School of General Studies at Columbia University, where she took classes with poets Leonie Adams and Stanley Kunitz, whom she described as mentors. Gluck has since taught at many institutions of higher education, including Goddard College, Williams College, Stanford University, Harvard University, Boston University, and the Iowa Writers Workshop. Currently, she is the Rosencrantz Writer in Residence at Yale University. In 2003, Gluck was named the 12th US Poet Laureate. That same year, she was named the judge for the Yale series of younger poets, a position she held until 2010. Her book of essays, proofs, and theories were awarded the Penn Award for Nonfiction. In addition to the Pulitzer and Burlingame Prizes, she has received many awards and honors for her work, including the Lannan Literary Award for Poetry, a Sarah Teasdale Memorial Award, the MIT Anniversary Medal, the Wallace Stevens Award, a National Humanities Medal, and a gold medal for poetry from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She has received fellowship from the Guggenheim and Rockefeller Foundations and from the National Endowment for the Arts, besides being a special consultant to the Library of Congress for that institution's bicentennial in 1999. She was also elected as a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets in 1999, a post she held until 2005. In 2003, she was appointed the final judge of the Yale series of younger poets, a position she held until 2010. And this year, in 2020, she was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for her unmistakable poetic voice that with austere beauty makes the individual existence universal. All these awards, honorary degrees, and a position at Yale all merely reflect the revered place she holds in the contemporary world of letters. And now I come to the important part of my talk, and that has to do with the poetic collections and the poems, the poetry, and the poetics of Louise Glück's works. Now, and here I would like to begin as a point of departure. I would like to quote a couple of lines from my eighth collection of poems, Vita Nova, which begins with an enigmatic exchange between a master and an apprentice. I quote, "The master said, 'You must write what you see, but what I see does not move me.' The master answered, 'Change what you see.'" So you see, this prodigal variety of fierce seeing of only one thing at a time and changing what she sees, these are Gluck's highest virtues indeed. Each of her book has begun, she admits, in a, I quote, "conscious diagnostic act, a swearing off of the work preceding it." Near the end of the book, the same book, Vita Nova, the apprentice recognizes the lesson of the master. I quote, "I have acquired in some measure the genius of the master, in whose supple mind time moves in two directions: backward from the act to the motive, and forward to just resolution." So she has a constantly fresh and unexpected way of stationing the self, the soul, vertically in relation to the works above or below it, to its past or impending future. Now, given Gluck's ecumenical relationship to traditions, its leanness of sentiment and precision of speech, her mutable stylistics, and the fact that her career now stretches over 5 decades, from 1968 to 2020, The issue of how to divide and organize a comprehensive study of her works, imposes both difficulties and some intriguing possibilities. Each book of Gloig, as Robert Hass. Now, Robert Hass himself is one of the most celebrated and widely read contemporary American poets, a leading critic, translator. Now, he mentioned that each book of Louise Glück deals with traumatic incidents or life cycle events, most often concerning the author's profoundly ambivalent relationship to other family members, to lovers, or to her natural surroundings. But we see that Gluck transforms her autobiographical self into a fictional construct. And taking cue from Robert Hass, and also alluding to Joanne Piet Deal's suggestion in a book on Louise Glück, what I would like to do over here is give you book by book account of her work. Now, so seeing Gluck's poems as complex analysis of the authorial self via sustained central metaphors, you find that we can read her poetry against a narrative pattern that shifts from the tones of anger, despair, and resentment found in her early Firstborn to the resignation of later collection Ararat, and proceeds in her still later volumes, including Vita Nova and Averno, towards an ambivalent embrace of embodied life. Uh, in her essay, The Best American Poetry, Gluck says that poems are autobiography, but divested of the trappings of chronology and comment, the metronomic alteration of anecdote and response, unquote. So, in her writing, Gluck seeks to distinguish the often uncontrollable aspects of the psyche and the mutability of the body from the linguistic self or selves that are more under the artist's control. Now, while the scholar Robert Baker has argued that Gluck is surely a confessional poet in some basic sense, the critic Michael Robbins has argued that Gluck's poetry, unlike that of confessional poets Sylvia Plath or John Berryman, depends upon the fiction of privacy. As Bonnie Costello argues in her analysis of Gluck's Against Sincerity, an essay concerning John Berryman, Gluck attempts to define an art involving the self and yet impersonal, negatively capable, or at least able to inhabit more than one perspective, to dramatize questions rather than project views. Now, the first collection of poems of Gluck, titled Firstborn, in the year 1968, it represents the speaker in a gloomy, even diseased landscape, in which she, through situations more nakedly autobiographical than in later volumes, responds to a world of brutal relationships with bitterness, disappointments, and disgust at how she is treated by lovers, doctors, and family members. A poem about an abortion entitled The Wound symbolizes the grim nature of the poet's world. Now, if the collection Firstborn is focused on abortion, broken love relationships, and a diseased landscape, then the second volume, The House on Marshland, 1975, is a book about maternity and a human world filled with life. Perhaps the fact that Gluck's son Noah was born in 1973 influenced the author's focus. In spite of the emphasis on birth giving and on imagery that critics have described as Eden-like, the number of points dealing with harvest suggests the author's awareness of mortality, of the loss of innocence, as well as the exchange of lived reality for its reflection in the constructed realm of poetry. Now, one signature feature of Gluck's poetry is giving um, voice to historical or literary figures known as persona poems. And the personas are bearing as Joan of Arc, Orpheus, and Eurydice, Penelope, and Abishag from the Hebrew Bible. Oftentimes, the eye of the persona seems to conflate with an eye of the autobiographical speaker that is separate from the voice of the original persona. And this conflation occurs in Telemachus's guilt in Meadowlands, where Telemachus, son of Odysseus and Penelope, speaks of searching for his father, who has been away for many years fighting in the Trojan War. I quote, "Patience of the sort my mother practiced on my father, which in his self absorption he mistook for tribute, though it was in fact a species of rage. Didn't he ever wonder why he was so blocked in expressing his native abandon? It infected my childhood." Now, mentions of the estrangement of my mother and my father imply that Telemachus's experience is felt not only by Telemachus himself, but also by another speaker, a personal I that is Gluck's own. And Telemachus's lines about his parents' relationship that infected my childhood echo a sentiment from the essay Education of a Poet, in which Gluck writes about a father's emotional timidity. This phrasing evokes Telemachus's words in the poem about his father being blocked. Thus, by imagining the significance of a life story through fantasy with mythic materials, Gluck does not so much attempt to escape from experience as she finds a means of giving shape to the documentary facts of her life, or what the poet has called a proof that suffering can be made somehow to yield meaning. Biblical creation myths and the pain of consciousness that stems from the author's fear of desertion by husband, son, and sibling are among some of the obsessive themes of the next collection, Descending Figure, the third collection, which was published in the year 1980, as are poems of death and dying children. The eponymous poem Descending Figure, as James Robinson has written, I quote, is a child's view in three parts of a dead sister, a figure descending, a sick child in a painting in Rijksmuseum, and the speaker's dead sister, unquote. The fourth collection, The Triumph of Achilles, deals with typical lyric themes, such as taking the risk to love what one knows must be lost. But it is distinct from the prior three books in that it looks forward to Gluck's repeated use of biblical and classical analogues to treat her primary themes in the three major narrative sequences from the 1990s. Ararat, which comes in 1990, The Wild Iris in 1992, and Meadowlands in 1996. Now, the Triumph of Achilles is pivotal because it marks Gluck's first major attempt to use Wendler's phrase, I quote, to give experience the permanent form of myth, unquote, without, as in Lowell, attempting to make the author's autobiographical experience itself mythic. Now, besides the title poem, other poems from the Triumph of Achilles that emphasize classical material include The Reproach and Apostrophe to Eros, Night Song, which Gluck has herself read as a reflection upon the figures of Eros and Psyche, The Fountain, which discusses the myth of Sisyphus, and Mythic Fragment, which recalls Ovid's story of Apollo and Daphne, who, to avoid, I quote, captivity in praise from the stern god, who is also her suitor, turns for help to her father, the river god Peneus, who transforms into a tree forever. Now, in Mythic Fragment, Helen Wendler, she says that Gluck retells the myth as a Freudian story, the tale of a girl too much in love with her father to accept a lover, and as a modern story of virginity, leaving its root in incestuous desire. Now, as Wendler's comment strongly suggests, the triumph of Achilles turns to the mythic mode for the detachment that allows Gluck to explore components that would have likely been subject for the analytic process she had undertaken years earlier. The impact of the daughter's ambivalent affection for and identification with and mourning over The loss of the mythified father will become central motives in both Ararat and the Wild Iris. Now, Ararat in 1990 consists of a series of elegiac poems set in the cramped quarters of a home of suburban mourners in Long Island. In poems such as Confession and Widows, Ararat documents how the emotionally benumbed speaker has learned from the older generation of Glück women how to survive the death of loved ones. She learns the lesson that one way to protect oneself from further despair is by renouncing the desire to forge compelling relationships with persons other than grieving widows. Absence becomes the metaphysical status quo for the widows. Now, the poem Mount Ararat from Ararat demonstrates alienation from and or even resentment towards Judaism. She's an American Jew, so the kind of conflicted relationship that she has with her own religion. Uh, the speaker stands at the grave of a sister, I quote, like the earth itself, every stone here is dedicated to the Jewish God who doesn't hesitate to take a son from a mother, unquote. So, in a Jewish graveyard where visitors traditionally place stones on top of the headstones, the speaker writes of the Jewish God being useless in preventing death of the son. And thus, the Jewish experience informs Gluck's poetry, but not always in affirming light. The next collection, The Wild Iris, consists of a trilogue of voices, God, the poet, and the flowers in the poet's garden. The flowers provide a kind of arena and act as a kind of referee for the debate between the two primary protagonists, the poet and the god. The natural cycle of life, death, and the resurrection in a garden thus become the literal ground for and the frame upon which this debate is carried out, while the plants and the flowers actively participate in this discussion. God's final words comes in the poem September Twilight. This poem seems to be spoken both to the poet and to the garden. I quote, I'm tired of you, chaos of the living world. I can only extend myself for so long to a living thing. I summoned you into existence by opening my mouth, by lifting my little finger. You come and go. Eventually, I forget your names. You come and go, every one of you flawed in some way compromised. You're worth one life, no more than that. I gathered you together. I can erase you as though you were a draft to be thrown away and exercise because I've finished you. Vision of deepest mourning. Now, I don't know how much time do I have. Do I have some time? Do I
I
have
think yes. Please continue. So it's so mesmerizing your talk. Please.
So now we come to first new work after the Wild Iris, which is the Meadowlands in 1996, which takes its impetus from Greek and Roman mythology. The book uses the voices of Odysseus and Penelope to create a kind of high-low rhetorical experiment in marriage studies, according to Deborah Garrison in the New York Times Book Review. Garrison, she says that through the suburban banter between the ancient wanderer and his wife, Meadowlands captures the way that a marriage itself has a tone, a set of shared vocal groups, inseparable from the particular personalities involved and the partial truces they have made along the way. Now, next collection of work is Vita Nova, and it is a book that exists in the long moment of spring, a book of deaths and beginnings, resignation and hope, brutal, luminous, and far-seeing. And then we have the ninth collection, the Seventh Ages, the Seven Ages, which includes a number of poems explicitly referring to Jewish themes that reflect the distance from Jewishness that she describes. The poem Memoir in the Seven Ages contains a reference to the Holocaust. I grew up on an island, prosperous in the second half of the 20th century. The shadows of the Holocaust hardly touched us, unquote. Now, such lines point to the depth of the assimilation of the family. At the same time, the lines might be interpreted with a sad irony, suggesting that in spite of their well-to-do status in America, the shadow of the Holocaust might have impacted the family greatly. Now, her 11th collection is called Averno, which is the 2006 National Book Award finalist for poetry. Now, Averno is a small crater a small crater lake in southern Italy, which is regarded by the ancient Romans as the entrance to the underworld. And that place gives its name to Lewis's 11th collection in landscape turned irretrievably to winter. It is a gate or passageway that invites traffic between two worlds, while at the same time resisting their reconciliation. Now, the six-part poem October in this collection begins in autumn, the inception of the dying season. It's a post 9/11 poem, and it engages with the world in crisis through an analysis of personal history and mythology, in particular, a double persona depicted in the figure of Persephone. The poem speaker traverses between the hybrid persona of Gluck and the mythic goddess Persephone and Demeter and the voices of the individual women. Now, these women exist in a liminal landscape after the violence and the destruction of the 21st century's reality of terrorism and war. In the poem's central argument, Gluck questions via an aphoretic dialogue whether or not to continue existence as the existential humanist writer, pondering the consequences of living or dying in the postmodern, post-classical wasteland, either a place to end in the apocalypse or a place to recreate everything that was taken away. He uses mythology, persona, prosopopia, and silence to explore past and present trauma in the postmodern void. This void is, as Jean Baudrillard observed and prophesied, a place where America has come to the end and where Gluck questions her role in recreating the myth and representing the historical. She tells us, I quote, "This is the present, an allegory of waste," unquote. So this book is an extended lamentation. The 12th collection, A Village Life, it begins in the topography of a village, a Mediterranean world of no definite moment or place. I quote, "All the reeds in the village unite at the fountain, avenue of liberty, avenue of the acacia trees. The fountain rises at the center of the plaza on sunny days, rainbows in the piss of the cherub," unquote. So around the fountain are concentric circles of figures organized by age and in degrees of distance, fields, a river, and like the fountain's opposite, a mountain. Human time is superimposed on geologic time, all taken in at a glance without any undue sensation of speed. Now, Gluck has been known as a lyrical and dramatic poet since Ararat. She has shaped her austere intensities into book length sequences. Here, for the first time, she speaks as the type of describing, supervising intelligence found in novels rather than poetry, as Langdon Hammer has written of her long lines, expansive, fluent, and full, manifesting a calm omniscience. While Gluck's manner is novelistic, she focuses not on action, but on pauses and intervals, moments of suspension rather than suspense, in a dreamlike present tense in which poetic speculation and reflections are possible. Uh, Louise Glück's next collection of poems titled Poems 1962 2012. This collection is monumental in scale. It's almost 627 pages. And it proved her 50 years of fierce poetic productivity. In it, Gluck wrote a series of linked dramatic monologues spoken by an artist struggling with silences and the inability to invent. Although Gluck has written about creative paralysis before, as in a poem like The Wild Iris, but his subject is the triumphant return to expression. However, in this new sequence of poems, she writes about the frightening condition of lying fallow one day after another without the prospect of renewal. Yet, incapacity itself becomes a creative source. Gluck's speaker discovers. In the White series, the last poem in this sequence, the painter returns to work by creating a large group of large canvases. I quote, "I cannot say exactly how these paintings came into being, though in the end there were many of them. And suffice to say, the paintings were immense and entirely white. unquote. So the narrator is like a poet who succeeds not in overcoming silence, but in making the experience itself visible. Now, in her latest collection, I will talk about her last collection. Now, in her essay, Disruption, Hesitation, Silence, Gluck writes, I quote, I do not think that more information always makes a richer poem. I'm attracted to ellipsis, to the onset, to suggestion, to eloquent, deliberate silence. The onset for me exerts power. Often I wish an entire poem could be made in this vocabulary, unquote. Among her remarkable experiments with form, her last volume, her latest volume, Faithful and Virtuous Night 2014, is also notable for the power of suggestion that hangs over the collection. As she writes in the afterword, a poem from the collection, I quote, reading what I have just written, now I believe, I stop precipitously, so that my story seems to have been slightly distorted, ending as it did, not abruptly, but in a kind of artificial mist of sort, sprayed into stages to allow for difficult set changes, unquote. This book won the National Book Award for Poetry in US in the same year. So taken together, Gluck's poetry collections intricately weave the autobiographical, the confessional, the mythological, and the biblical. Some of the major themes explored by Gluck are desire, hunger, trauma, survival, motherhood, family, conflict, marriage, separation, intimacy, body, death, grief, and nature. Gluck draws on multiple textual traditions throughout her work, in particular Greek mythology, fairy tales, and stories from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Other influences Gluck names are uh, Shakespeare, Blake, Yeats, and Eliot, the poets she read in childhood. And these influences are manifest in Gluck's lyric poems with an economy of language and often sharp lineation. Now, in fact, Gluck's writing most often evades any identification. It evades ethnic identification, religious classification, or gendered affiliation. In fact, her poetry often negates critical assessments that affirm identity politics as criteria for literary evaluation. She resists canonization as a hyphenated poet, that is, as a Jewish American poet or a feminist poet or a nature poet. She prefers instead to retain an aura of iconoclasm or an in-betweenness. I quote, many critics have placed her in the line of American poets who value fierce lyric compression, from Emily Dickinson to Elizabeth Bishop. Gluck has written that her uh, preference from the beginning is the poetry that requests or craves a listener, unquote. So Gluck's poetry invites a sense of active reading and active listening, calling us to explore the tapestry of personal history, tales, and texts intertwined in her poems, which call us, in turn, more deeply into ourselves. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Haider, for this excellent overview. Within a span of, I think, 30 minutes, you have covered so much ground that it's very difficult to do that, and you have achieved almost the impossible, I would say. So thank you very much. And now I think we will have the session that we were all looking forward to, the poetry reading session. And so who is going to be first, Dr. Anil? Is there any sequence for this, or can you?
We'll go with the volunteers first. Otherwise, we'll put ourselves in.
Okay. So would you like to begin?
No issues.
Okay. So then I can pitch in after that.
I'll begin myself. So thank you, Professor. Actually, I have noted down a substantial number of things that you have spoken. I neither have the phenomenal memory nor the dexterity to have every record of it right at the moment. But wonderful, so to speak. We will come to it all during the discussions. So I have the task of reading out a poem right at the moment. Uh, Actually, I read this poem years ago, and I'm afraid a lot of water has flowed under the bridge ever since. My first reading of this poem did indeed not leave me overwhelmed, to be very frank, to be honest. Possibly I thought it was no different from the famous fable involving the ever righteous King Solomon. That was my understanding of the poem then. While I read the poem a couple of times later, there emerged more and more insights. And when I read it 2 days ago, a sense of indescribability actually engulfed my heart. And I have romanced it several times till this moment, so to say. And believe me, I sit at this gathering with a mind discernible only to those that would care to be in my shoes. A poem which I thought was for the consumption of a fifth grader at some point in time in my life. Tugs at my heart, especially the line, the one who could not bear to divide her mother. Truth can hit you from anywhere. That's what I understand. This is LG Louise Glück for you, ladies and gentlemen, and LG who would convert a platitude into a poignant poem, and LG who would portray the natural bereft of poetic sublimes or grandeur, ostentations, figures, or grandeurs, or any other settings, so to speak. This is so simple, that's what I'm trying to say. Here is a lovely poet conveying a fact as an idea, and her ability to express her selfhood or individual identity, as I understand, distinguishes her from the mere mortals like me. Believe me, she has created a thrilling alternate world, as I said earlier, running parallel to that of her illustrious predecessors and the contemporaries, so to speak. So here we go. And her gravitas is way beyond an Oscar or any other honors can really define. May I make an endeavor to read out the piece for every one of you? A piece shorter than the inordinately longer introduction that I have attempted. The axiom brevity is the soul of wit is certainly not reserved for the lesser mortals like me. Hold me excuse for my impending failure to convey the poignancy LG indeed does, hoping this disclaimer spares me the blushes. So here we are. Two women, the same claim came to the feet of the wise king. Two women, but only one baby. The king knew someone was lying. What he said was, let the child be cut in half. The way no one will go empty handed. He drew his sword. Then, of the two women, one renounced her share. This was the sign, the lesson. Suppose you saw your mother torn between two daughters. What could you do to save her? But be willing to destroy yourself. She would know who was the rightful child, the one who couldn't bear to divide the mother. The one who couldn't bear to divide the mother. This is the line that tugs at my heart. And this is one line, this is one poem that did not make indeed an impact on me many years ago. The more you read, the more you get into the nuances. Here is a different world she has created for you. So that's the poem. Hold me excused for the failings of or not being able to convey the emotions or the passion that she intended. Thank you.
That's a great narration. And maybe I can go next with your permission.
Sure.
So I have chosen, I had actually chosen three, but I would probably, just read one. And maybe if time permits, I'll come back to the rest. So the one that I have chosen is the one that's called Aboriginal Landscape. So this poem appeals to me for its lyrical quality, but beyond the lyrical quality, what I could perceive is the sensitivity of the poet in trying to capture those small moments of certitude, those small moments of emotion. That's what kind of captures my imagination in this. So let me begin. Aboriginal Landscape by Louise Glück. You were stepping on your father, my mother said. And indeed, I was standing exactly in the center of a bed of grass, mown so neatly it could have been my father's grave, although there were no stones saying so. You're stepping on your father, she repeated, louder this time, which began to be strange to me, since she was dead herself. Even the doctor had admitted it. I moved slightly to the side to where my father ended and my mother began. The cemetery was silent. Wind blew through the trees. I could hear very faintly sounds of weeping several rows away, and beyond that, a dog wailing. At length, these sounds abated. It crossed my mind I had no memory of being driven there to what now seemed a cemetery, though it could have been a cemetery in my mind only. Perhaps it was a park, or if not a park, a garden or bower, perfumed. I now realized, with the scent of roses, dossier de vivre filling the air, the sweetness of living, as the saying goes. At some point, it occurred to me I was alone. Where had the others gone, my cousins and sister, Caitlin and Abigail? By now, the light was fading. Where was the car waiting to take us home? I then began seeking for some alternative. I felt an impatience growing in me, approaching, I would say, anxiety. Finally, in the distance, I made out a small train, stopped, it seemed, behind some foliage, the conductor lingering against a door frame, smoking a cigarette. Do not forget me, I cried, running now over many plots. Many mothers and fathers. Do not forget me, I cried, when at last I reached him. Madam, he said, pointing to the tracks, surely you realize this is the end. The tracks do not go further. His words were harsh, and yet his eyes were kind. This encouraged me to press my case harder. But they go back, I said, and I remarked their sturdiness as though they had many such returns ahead of them. You know, he said, our work is difficult. We confront much sorrow and disappointment. He gazed at me with increasing frankness. I was like you once, he added, in love with turbulence. Now I spoke as to an old friend. What of you, I said, since he was free to leave, have you no wish to go home, to see the city again? This is my home, he said, the city. The city is where I disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shantanu. Wonderful as always. Uh, Inviting Dr. Manika to read her poem next.
Hello, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Hello, everyone. Hello, Professor Haider, Professor Himadri. So I'm also going to read one poem. It's called Saints. So I'll just read it. In our family, there were two saints, my aunt and my grandmother. But their lives were different. My grandmother's was tranquil even at the end. She was like a person walking in calm water, For some reason, the sea could not bring itself to hurt her. When my aunt took the same path, the waves broke over her. They attacked her, which is how the fates respond to a true spiritual nature. My grandmother was cautious, conservative. That's why she escaped suffering. My aunts escaped nothing. Each time the sea retreats, someone she loves is taken away. Still, she won't experience the sea as evil. To her, it is what it is. Where it touches land, it must turn to violence. So I really like this poem because I think it talks about two ways of living. Maybe that's my interpretation. So one is the grandmother's way of living, where you choose not to be affected by anything in life, and maybe the other way is the way of aunt, where you are open to everything that comes as it is. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. Wonderful recitation. So we will have a student coming in now. Um, can I, Dr. Shantanu, can we just put a student in and then listen to Professor?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. So let me invite Diant, MA second year, to make a recitation.
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. I am Byan from MA second year. So today I would like to recite a poem titled as Early Darkness by Louise Glück. So I start. How could you say earth should give me joy? Each thing born is my burden. I cannot succeed with all of you. And you would like to dictate to me. You would like to tell me who among you is most valuable, who most resembles me. And you hold up as an example the pure life, the detachment you struggle to achieve. How can you understand me when you cannot understand yourselves? Your memory is not powerful enough. It will not reach back far enough. Never forget, you are my children. You are not suffering because you touched each other, but because you were born, because you required life separate from me. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Diant. Now,
We can have another student again.
can I invite to receive? Okay.
Good afternoon, one and all present here. Myself, Kushdeep Kaur from Department of English Studies, and I am going to recite the poem by Louise Glück, which is entitled as The Past. So here it is. Small light in the sky appearing suddenly between two pine boughs, their fine needles now etched onto the radiant surface, and above this high, feathery heaven, smell the air. That is the smell of a white pine, most intense when the wind blows through it, and the sound it makes equally strange, like the sound of the wind in a movie. Shadows moving, the ropes making the sound they make. What you hear now will be the sound of the nightingale, chordata, the male bird courting the female. The ropes shift, the hammock sways in the wind, tied firmly between two pine trees. Smell the air, that is the smell of the white pine. It is my mother's voice you hear, or is it only the sound the trees make when the air passes through them? Because What sound would it make passing through nothing? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kushdeep. Wonderful rendition.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. So
We have one more student. I think Manu is there.
Can we put Manu in? Okay, okay, may I request Manu?
Yeah, sure, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. Myself, Manu Tuli. I am PhD research scholar at Akal University. And today I have chosen to read Gluck's poem Solitude from her collection A Village Life. The reason behind I have selected this poem is that there is immense use of nature, rain, and other things. Plus, it shows how nature can be destructive. Plus, it also resembles to some extent to the present conditions as well. So, shall I start? It's very dark today. Through the rain, the mountain isn't visible. The only sound is rain, driving life underground. And with the rain, cold comes. There will be no moon tonight, no stars. The wind rose at night. All morning, it lashed against the wheat. At noon, it ended. But the storm went on, soaking the dry fields, then flooding them. The earth has vanished. There's nothing to see, only the rain gleaming against the dark windows. This is the resting place where nothing moves. Now we return to what we were, animals living in darkness, without language or vision. Nothing proves I am alive. There is only the rain. The rain is endless. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Manu. Wonderful. So it's now we are coming to one of those most important parts of the program. May I now invite Professor Himadri to share his insights with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anil. Thanks, Shantanu. It was pleasant hearing Nishat talking about the entire details of her background as well as the poems in details. I'll just choose those themes which just now everyone had recited, especially Anil Ji, you, Shantanu, Manika, Viant, Kushdeep, and Manu. The recitations that you had, the poems, were basically talking about three important things. One was desire, the other was nature, and the third was trauma. If you look into the poems very carefully, that most of the enjambments that they have in the poems, the lyrics, rather the sentences, the syntax is incomplete in each of the sentences, and it doesn't get completed till the last where the poem ends. So it carries a form of desire that needs to be acquired, the ability to convey the truth that in Gluck's poem, in most of her poem, we see it across, which Nishat had very well established through different, all the poems she quoted, all the books she had, Gluck had written. Now, when we talk about love and attention that you see in the poem that Anilji had recited, or the Kushdeep's poem, both talks about somewhere the desire to a morality, desire to acquire a language which is more relevant to the readers. That's why probably Nishat began her whole speech with saying that it is almost like hearing her, it is like earning $1. It is almost like that. That is where the acquiring this morality, she's talking about the language that is very important. So therefore, when we talk about the language that Gluck always uses is mostly that metalinguistic structure that we see where the symbols are used to represent lots of meanings in it, whether it is the landscape that Shantanu was talking about, like the example of symmetry that Shantanu is talking in her Gluck's poem. Like we see that the symmetry talks about something which is not only death, it's not only loss, it's also an attempt to heal something. It's attempt to heal a morality or attempt to heal the powerlessness that we see in each of these landscapes. And therefore, when we talk about the Beyond took that poem called Early Darkness, we see that Early Darkness is talking about those trauma that Gluck herself had faced. The death of her elder sister, which happened much before she was born. Now, how does this affect the child? It brings out lots of things into her own life as well as her poems. From the poem to the firstborn to the last poem, the Virtuous Night, the collection of Virtuous Night. If you see that, we see that there are certain kind of triggering out of those losses, the pains, that the death, the failed relationships, the relationships in general, the emotional turbulence that she was undergoing is all revealed with each word that she is using as to compose her own poems. Now, when we say that, I don't want to go on that debate of whether she is a confessional poet or not. That has already been, Nishat had already discussed that. Now, coming back to that, when we talk about the saints, or when we talk about solitude, we see nature coming in most of our poems also. It is almost like reading the romantic poets, like so beautiful it is. But it reminds, at a certain point, it was reminding me of Eliot's Westland when I was reading Marshland, The House of Marshland, as well as Eliot's poems all the time revealing in front of me all the time. It is like pointing of self-understanding and self-consciousness that we have all the time, emotive in her language. That is very, very important. That the flower can have an emotive voice. She says somewhere in her interview also, the flowers, the plants, the leaves, everything can speak. And this language is so important that even in Wild Irish, she says that deities speak when the change, how the change the weather through the seasons, that the deities are speaking. Like if the deity is angry, if the summer comes in. If the deity is sad, the rain falls. That way, the whole poem collections of Wild Diaries or Ararat. If you see Ararat, which is very related to the loss, where the mourning is been symbolized through all possible identifications that she is using. Like Nishat had already told about ethnic identity, religious identity, as well as gendered affiliation that she considers to. But when we look into her poems, she at many places had given credentials to one is Leonie Adams, the other one is Stanley Kunitz. Both of them, it's not only talking about syntax. Both of them were trying to use philosophy or psychoanalysis as musings, so that I remember Kunitz's poem collection, The Testing Tree, where he was basically talking on how a tree is not only metaphysical or meta language of garden, but it is also self-identifying itself against standing everyone and standing tall. So it is breaking lots of laws. It is breaking lots of identity of being in the plant vegetation or in the habitat. But similarly, we see also in these poems like Manu's last, what Manu recited is solitude. In solitude, the words like resting place, it talks about, it conveys the truth of mortality, the truth of mortality. It is not only mortality she is talking about, she is also talking about an alienation, that you cannot alienate yourself from human life. You cannot alienate many things. And therefore, like disgust, anger, fear, disappointment, despair, everything is so visible in her poems that at many times, as Nishat very rightly said, we see a postmodern void in her, which is also called postmodern vertigo in Gluck's poems. Now, Gluck's poems talks not only of loss of different kind, lots of emotions, but also loss of hope. At many places, she talks about in such a way that there are certain losses and which leads to loneliness, And therefore, these loneliness, it's not only isolation, it is also about, like reminding one of self-perpetuation or self-contagion, like you are not part of the society and consider society be too a disease, where you see Aboriginal Landscape is also talking about that on those terms, that you are stepping on your father. That means you are also following the social norms. She is trying to break those kind of, she's talking about family loneliness, where she talks about how Greek mythology has affected her, and therefore her Triumph of Achilles comes in. And when we talk about nature, we also see over here, I remind of the philosopher, psychoanalyst, basically, Holmes Rolston, where he talks about that emotions are many times, when we try to see emotions in nature, it is sometimes discontinuous, because many times nature resists, and we fear. Resist, like there is a, say, flood. There is, for example, flood. I remember one poem from Eliot's lines that you feel scared to get out of that comfort bed and put your first feet on the cold ground. That kind of thing we see in Gluck's poems also. And this is exactly what Ralston is trying to say. There is a discontinuity in emotions, in human emotions, that we're trying to relate it to nature. And also there is, simultaneously, there is a contradiction in Gluck's poems, that we see emotions are also continuous. Emotions at many places, we embrace nature, like the son is following the father's footsteps, or the nature is trying to accompany her when she is alone. This kind of love and embracement between nature and human emotions are always there. And one reminds me of this, when I was reading these poems of nature by Gluck, I was reminding of this Japanese tradition of spending time with nature, which is called Shinrin Yoku. And Shinrin Yoku is almost like you go to the nature, talk to the nature, you feel the nature all the time. And that is how you come out of human isolation, you come out of this despair, you come out of the losses, not only cultural loss, not only existential loss, not only relational loss, but lots of other losses or loneliness. You come in close to nature, and that is where I think Gluck stands apart, but not only mourning in Ararat or the marshland, where romance has been talked about, romantic tradition has been talked about, but also simultaneously interrogating the nature all the time, and through affirmations, through reconciliations, through sensuous immediacy, all these things we keep on seeing that it is not only navigating relationship, a human relationship with nature, but it is also trying to bring out memories which makes human insecure, or human develop a sense of fear. Mental exhaustions also happen, depressions happen. The forms of disorders are seen, that we see in novel writing during the late or the Victorian period or late Victorian period. We see all these things happening all the time simultaneously. There is obviously development of social cognitions, that we keep on saying that grief has to be addressed in a form of homesickness, or social circle has to be there to support you all the time. I feel Gluck at many points in her poems have talked not only about existential humanist humanist views, but also humanist views through loss, through hope, to despair, but also a very interesting fact that we see in Gluck's poem is a man's lack to control fate, or lack to control the emotions that they are. It is almost in the words of Lovecraft's poems, and or you say Kafka's writings, or Camus' writings. We see these kind of existential crises across the board through all her poems. It is not only gender. If you bring gender into it, we always see that she is talking about motherhood. Motherhood becomes so important. It is not only about the firstborn, it is about the fear, it is about the pain that has to undergo. That is the whole womb being an universe to himself, to herself, sorry. It reminds one of Advaita's monoism, that the whole universe is coming to oneself, and then you're trying to romanticize the whole feeling of motherhood into naturalistic philosophies or existential philosophies. It is like not only these are governing her world, but she is trying far beyond this. She is trying to make emotions that do not have, her quotation I'll quote, that emotions do not have any survival. They die. Once the firstborn, if you read the poem Firstborn, you'll see that towards the end of it, after the baby is born, her whole feeling of motherhood like almost died. The carrying the child inside her body and separating it apart almost leads to that kind of despair. That this is where the whole idea of lyrics that Gluck tried to bring into the poems is very different. It is very different. Every now and then we see that literary evaluation is being happening from each poem from the same collection. If you take in if you take Wild Diaries, each poem differs from the other. It is like evaluating each, the one which leaves the question, one if leaves the question of intelligence, the other questions the intelligence. If one leaves the question of innocence, the other answers the innocence. This way it is like almost connecting to each other and reconnecting and disconnecting. This is where it is very important for us to understand her grief response or bereavement that she has undergone through her poems. I think that is where she stands far apart when we talk about her as a poet. It is not that she is, of course, like as Nishat says also, Baker, at some sense, she's a first person mode because she's using first person mode. Therefore, like she can be confessional poet, but it is not. It is somehow, I feel her like Michael Robbins's point of view is very, very important. The fiction of privacy. The privacy, she is fictionalizing that privacy. She is not trying to say, is it true that how far it is true that she's losing a sister whom she has never seen, she has never felt her sister, and still feeling the pain inside her. It is not only that leading to a different kind of disorders, but it also leaving her life to a certain extreme form where we see that the fiercely reconciliation is possible, and she used to be really shy away from things, and she was very vocal, and because of her physical ailment she could not go to her schooling or higher education wasn't possible. Now this is very important. That's why I'm saying, like, being not getting so much of education but getting education from both her parents makes her a different altogether a different person, a different kind of a persona, a different kind of poet, which cannot be categorized in one particular group and say, okay, she is a confessional poet, or she is a persona poet, or she is a gender poet, or she is an identity politics poet. No, nothing like that. You see everything clubbed into her poems, and gradually they're developing. And towards the end, how she is complaining that what had happened was not justified. Now what is going to happen is something to be hoped for, but you don't know whether the hope is real or unreal about it. So that is very, very important for us to understand her poems all the time. And we have to keep in mind that most of her work is also related to existentialism at many points and postmodern vertigos at many points. Now, how do we relate that? That's a long discussion probably that we can do some other time. But over here, I would end by saying that absolute knowledge, that which Hegel is trying to say, or Faubourg's what is called realizations of own humanism, is something which we see in her poem as she was developing towards the end of her career, towards the later poems that we see after 2009, the 9/11's case. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor. Lots of things, especially feedbacks about the poems recited. Wonderful. Actually, in one of the interviews, if I can remember reading it.
Dr. Anil, before we go into your analysis or your feedback,
I'm not analyzing right now.
May I request all the participants who are wishful of receiving their participation certificates to fill up the participation form It is available in your chat box, both in the YouTube as well as in
The link
the
is there.
Zoom link. So if you just click it and fill up the forms with the particulars, you'll receive your certificates. So thank you.
So thank you, Professor, once again. In one of the interviews, if I can resume, the interviewer tells her it is the business of literature to turn facts into ideas. So, in fact, she did not reply in the affirmative. She did not agree with what had been observed completely, but she confessed the possibility of her being unconsciously so, actually. And perhaps she was being modest, but at the end of it all, we have got to conclude that there is an element of that in her writings. So, as I understand, most of her poems are prose poems. They are ligatures that allow the whole to cohere with, so many things with such a ridiculous ease. So this is something which I have not seen in her contemporaries or predecessors, so to speak. This is something that I discussed earlier. That's why I say she is among these luminaries and also has set a parallel world for herself, which not many of the poets could have made a claim to, actually, as a matter of fact. And as Toro says, truth strikes us behind in the dark, and for Gluck, it can hit you from anywhere. So it is truth expressed in manifold ways, and there is hardly any world that she has not traversed. So which both of you have wonderfully expostulated, so to speak. And some of the pertinent points I have noted down here. Professor Nishat, ecumenical relations, sustained central metaphors, ambivalent embrace of embodied life, dramatized questions than project views. So lots of interesting things coming up here. So now it's time for probably the discussions. There are participants, there are members of faculty and students waiting to throw in their insights or hear from you. Looking forward to hearing from you. So I leave the floor open right now. Members of the faculty, students. Yeah, so we will start with sir.
Yeah, so let me set the ball rolling. And, so what really, catches my attention in both the discussion by the narration by Professor Nishat and then by Professor Himadri, so ably put, is that there are thematic separations. And, so nothing captures that better than, the first couple of lines from Averno. So when she says, you die when your spirit dies, otherwise you live. You may not do a good job of it, but you go on. Sometimes you have no choice about. So that in a sense, sums up for me the postmodern existence to some extent as well. So do you think that in her poetry, this is for Nishat, do you think that in her poetry she is celebrating that that division in some way or the other? Like it's like a pathos that comes out, she lives it, and through that pain she is trying to come to terms with her own grief.
In fact, Professor Shantanu Ghosh, you've asked the question and you've answered it yourself.
Oh, no, not at all.
What exactly she is. This is exactly what she's trying to do. She is trying, each book of hers is a quest to understand herself. And she evades any one-to-one relationship of her own personal life and facts with her works, and she dissuades her readers, and she doesn't believe in giving interviews. In one place, in one instance, in one of her interviews with Morris, she says that I don't like giving interviews because I'm constantly changing, and people take what I say, what I do, to be the fact of my life, as the fact of my life. Whereas I'm the sum of all these parts, and in fact, the sum of all these parts is, in fact, bigger and uh, than what the sum actually should be. So she's trying to evade that kind of relation that we as readers try to pin her down and her works, and try to understand and relate it to her life. And each book is a quest, uh, and she believes in change, and each volume, as I said, unless and until we do each book, book by book account of her works, and the treatment and her approach, and poetics, it would be impossible to understand Louise Glück entirely. I mean, it's very difficult to encapsulate all that she has to say, all that she desires to do within 30 minutes, or even for a lifetime, because some of her poems are so intense and they're so multi-layered. You excavate the layers, and she's an archaeologist of emotions, as if.
Oh, absolutely fabulous term, archaeology of emotions. I love that.
You just peel off the layers, and something else comes up. And as a mother, as a wife, as a lover, it has different resonance at different times, and every time you read even the same poem, it brings a fresh perspective. So yes, you ask a question and you answer it yourself, and you have to pay for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that insightful answer. It's also at one level, looking for our own answers while reading poetry,
Absolutely.
trying to find out the convergences of her life with our own, and what she writes resonates so well with most of us, and that's probably what the Nobel Committee meant when they said that universality of personal experience going into, so some kind of personal going into the universal. So I think that's a good example of what you said, the archaeology of emotions. So that's a really great term. Maybe so we can build on that for another seminar. So when time comes. So that's exact. So I would like others to also pitch in with questions. Students and faculty members, you're most welcome.
I have come to feel that she is both visceral and cerebral.
Wow. Again, a mixture of the opposites.
Yeah. The others, members of the faculty, students, we can take
Any
turns.
observations people have, like, so students also can come up with.
Yeah, both members of the faculty and students, observations, questions, insights, anything welcome.
And just to break the silence, one could do a lot of psychoanalytical reading of her text, and also try to foreground her text within the current theories of trauma studies. And through that, how she wrenches out those the repressed pain and longing and loss from the realm of the unconscious, and brings it to the fore in the form of text and poetry. So that could be, a very, very fertile and fecund area of further research, if any of the students would be interested to do that.
No,
You
absolutely.
also talked about her in-betweenness, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that in psychology is called, staying away from excluded middle fallacy.
Absolutely.
Not taking the extremes.
I agree.
Waiting for the house. Uh, Students,
All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Harish from Department of English Studies, Akal University. And I have a question. I have a question that the Nobel Committee usually, but not always, there are sometimes there are political motives to award. So like as in Sartre or as in Boris Pasternak in 1957, I think. So do you think there is any specific agenda or reason, any observations? It might not be the final, but any observations which anyone here can feel from the faculty or the guests, anyone?
I mean, the politics of inclusion and exclusion and the agendas and, the various things that go into the selection, who's selected and who's not. It's always, this entire question is rife with some kind of confusion or some kind of, allegation. But put that apart. You evaluate the work on its own merit. You read it and then you realize that it is, in fact, I feel that it is rather too late that she got it. She should have got it. It should have been conferred on earlier.
Yes,
But
ma'am.
then that's my opinion.
agree.
I also I feel somehow that Harish, what you are asking basically is like, is there any politics of giving out awards? I would not say there are politics, but if she had deserved the award, I would say that after the book she has written on when she was talking about her isolation and Meadowlands or Vita Nova, I think she should have got then only. Because those books were so relevant during those contemporary times. But again, if you see that way, then whenever the prize comes, you are recognizing her work internationally, her work being talked about. Probably when you are having discussion today, before that, hardly people have read Gluck. I don't remember people reading Gluck so often like Emily Dickinson people read. Like Emily Dickinson, everyone knows her way of explaining things, her way of morbidity and all those things. But similarly, Gluck also follows that line, but I do not say that they are comparing each other. Now, the angle of, as Nishat already pointed out, exclusion and inclusion becomes so important these days. That's a part of the whole ball game that happens, that whom to exclude, whom to include. When Chinese writer Jin Zhang got the Nobel Prize, people started talking, so now China is the target. So similarly, like you have to think about those terms also. Her work is not only about keeping, she herself resent at many places, her resentment has been shown through her poem against the religious resentment that we talk about. We talk about religious alienation. She somehow didn't believe in that Judaism at all, but to include her in the Nobel and giving her award, if you bring Judaism to that angle, probably that is very unfair on that part. I feel that would be very unfair because you're overlooking all her creativity in it. Like I would say in modern context, she is another Dickinson of today's times.
Also, if Stephen Hawking had been alive today, he would have got the Nobel Prize for Physics rather than Roger Penrose. There's always, something, it's always open for discussion. But then,
Conjectures.
Thank you, ma'am. And thank you, sir.
Mistakes do happen. Mahatma Gandhi never got it, although she deserved probably much better. MLK, I think that's another one that people, so these kinds of mistakes do happen. And Nobel Committee, in honoring somebody, probably recognizes the whole body of work that they do over a period of time, and that the recognition comes not only for a single work or a couple of things, except in sciences sometimes both peace and economics and and the literature prizes, they are given basically for a plethora of work over decades of work. So that way it's a good thing that she probably could have got it earlier, but now she has got it. We are happy.
The competition is so stiff that sometimes even the jury will have to go for the trade-off. So it's very complex. It's very difficult to comment from the comment from our homes. Uh, what happens basically is, as Dr. Shantanu has pointed out, it is for the perhaps or arguably for the lifetime achievement. So that justifies. It certainly does not rule out Hari's question. There might be somebody who probably is equally meritorious. At the end of the day, you have around 10 or 15 of the members of the jury who will have to go for the trade-off. And comparing her with Emily Dickinson or Robert Frost, because comparisons across eras happen to be very, very odious, because apples and once again the question of apples and oranges come in. So it's difficult to make comparisons. So we do not know. We can go on living in conjectures as to whether it has been a politically motivated award or so. But we can go on debating until the cows come home. That's what happens in most of the democratic countries. And so do we. Thank you. More questions, more insights.
This really shows that she's a very dense poet. For the audiences to throw up questions, they need to truly grasp and soak in, assimilate her verses. And
it's actually very short notice, so people, probably never heard of her, except some specialists.
Her simplicity is very deceptive. There are layers within layers that you have to actually excavate in order to get at the root, or if you get at the root at all, to understand or get a semblance of what she's aiming to say. So I pity the audiences, because
it happens. So it happens, her writings face truth that most people or most writers deny. So it happens, and it takes time. Another 100 years down the road, she might sit celestially with a legendary status. So one never knows. Only time can tell. So that happens.
Very true.
So we haven't had any further questions.
That speaks of the wonderful discussion of Professor Himadri Roy. He put together all the points. So it was such a beautiful and seamlessly drawn understanding. So cutting across the various discourses. So
he put them all together, amalgamated them.
Yes, I have one request from our guests, because sometimes, even for us, sometimes these poems are so overwhelming, as Nishan ma'am has said, because there are several layers. So is there any suggestion would you like to give to our students how to comprehend, how to begin reading these poems, such kind of multi-layered poems, because these are sometimes so overwhelming, and even sometimes these can turn boring, because in the first reading we cannot get the proper meaning of that. So any suggestions for our students, undergraduate and PG students?
what I would suggest, as the new critics do, just read as you would, and just read and read them aloud, the poems. You read them aloud, and if they give you goosebumps, at times they do. Because when I was preparing my talk, I had collected so much of material and I was reading so many of her poems that and all through, I got into some kind of a trance like kind of a state. But what I would suggest, since you're students, is that you read her prose works first. Proofs and Theories, Essays on Poetry, that was published in 1994. And another, a collection of essays called American Originality, Essays on Poetry, as a point of departure, for they give you good insights into what she understands by good.
Freeze over.
It appears there are some streaming issues.
So that's fine.
Yeah.
So maybe
what I would
Himadri,
suggest, what I would suggest is, like, as Nishat already pointed out, that the prose collections have to be read first. Along with it, like, she can be brought into any perspective you want to read her poems from the feminist perspective to identity perspective, from race perspective, from a continental perspective, from any kind of perspective you want to read her poems. It is always allowed, because when you are teaching romantic poets, also you can bring her and then describe her way of romanticism. So therefore, like, when we read her poems, some isms become very important. Some philosophies are always to be taken into consideration. That's why whenever what topic comes on, whether it is postmodern, whether it is romantic, whether it is gender perspective, anything, her poems can be included and can be interpreted, provided as a teacher we chose exactly which poems are to be taken into.
And her poems are anything but boring. So
they have this quality. So they have this quality of, the moment you start feeling that, oh, it's going in a particular direction, there comes a statement, there comes a line which just jerks you up and makes you realize that no, what is being said is completely different. So, and it happens multiple times in the same poem. So that's very, very typical of, writing short stories, plots, twists and turns, and that's what brings to the emotional roller coaster, or the layers that you are talking about, the archaeological layers of meaning that one chooses to discover. And part of the reason why we chose to have this poetry reading along with the talks is to initiate reading into her poetry and her prose as well. So although we just stuck to poetry, the essays that she has written, the critical essays that you brought up, so they probably showcase a window into her mind, the way she thinks and way she writes her poems probably is not divergent from that.
Absolutely.
So that way we want to introduce this wonderful American poet to the audience and the students, not just because she has won the Nobel Prize, but also because she has been writing for I think 5 decades now, almost 5 decades.
Absolutely.
So Manika, I think you can always pitch in.
Yes, sir. Okay. And sir, as we have been talking about her dealing with the ideas of trauma, because in most of her work, so it's about death, and it's about mortality, it's about suffering and pain. So while I was reading some of her work, so since we had the seminar today, so I was just introducing myself with a work which I hadn't come across earlier. So I came across this poem, A Fantasy. So in which it's about a widow who had lost her spouse, and the poem ends where I just quote the last 2 lines of this poem. The widow, she wants to be back in the cemetery, back in the sick room, the hospital,
She knows it is not possible, but it is her only hope. The wish to move backward. And just a little, not so far as the marriage and the first kiss. So what I was thinking about that, now this widow, so she is not actually thinking of going back to the marriage and the first kiss. She's just thinking about going back to, only a little in time when she was perhaps in hospital, in the sick room with her partner. So with the idea of trauma also comes this appreciation of the little things in life. So that also I found very beautiful about her works. So because a heart who has gone through the trauma, so also it begins to appreciate those little delights of life. So just I wanted to add this observation of mine.
And
Thank you.
revisiting loss and trauma through poetic creation is or can be compared to acting out in Freudian terms. And though the modern trauma theorists would have us believe that they cannot be total working through, as Freud believed, the recent trauma theorists like Kathy Garuth, Sushona Feldman, and Dory Lobb and others, they say that, but there is, when you talk about hope, when you talk about some kind of, some reassuring voice, there is some, or rather a few moments of working through that trauma. So yes, you're absolutely right on that count, Monica.
Yes, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Monica, madam. So it's time actually to have a moderated version of what we have actually heard. As I understand, as you would perhaps agree, no poet speaks for all of us, but some do come close. And here is one of them. And today we have had a program celebrating Glück, LG. Now, perhaps we can look forward to, in the near future, exploring LG. And in half an hour's time, or in 1 hour's time or so, or with some cursory discussions, I don't think we will arrive anywhere. So it takes time, it needs energy, it needs our efforts, it needs the passion, and it needs the endeavors and labor to really do an exhaustive work. That will be a tremendous effort required of you. So if I can moderately understand, it is, she's not a poet you read to cheer yourself up all the time. You may. And she, however, is a poet of wisdom. Absolutely no doubt about it. And as I mentioned earlier, an LG book can be both visceral and cerebral. So those of you who are very good in biology may understand. So will those who are good in psychology. Now, of course, in literature, it is it's an oft-used term, full of thought, full of grit and pith. And if you look for pessimism, she is there. If you look for optimism, she is there. Sagacity, she is there. Prudence, she is there. And she deserves a place in the galaxy, definitely. And only time will tell. As I told you earlier, another 100 years down the road, we will all be gone. And these are the works that will not be destroyed. This is her legacy, which will not be destroyed by the relentless onslaught of time. This I can be sure of. So it's absolutely important that we read and read. I told you when I read out a poem, this is one poem which did not make any impact upon me many years ago. And today it's different. And maybe because the hairline is receding, or getting no younger. But at the end of the day, you will have to understand that there is some insight you have gained by reading a work several times and doing some research. I'm not speaking it, from the perspective of a PhD or so. That's different. That's entirely different. That has got its own nomenclature. It is very much nomenclature. Say non-nomenclature research you can do, and I will personally do it myself. So I can conclude, no poet speaks for us all, but here is a person who comes close. So I would like to thank Professor Himadri, Professor Nishat, wonderful expostulations. I have noted down a lot of things. I told you my dexterity is not phenomenal, neither is my memory. There are things that I have noted down for my own consumption and dissemination later on. And Professor Himadri, as a matter of fact, put them all together. Whatever he has heard, perhaps he had the advantage of being the second speaker. I don't know. I don't really know. So he put them all together, capsuled them, and presented to the audience. Wonderful, sir. So there is a sense of overwhelming engulfing all of us, and this is new to most of us. And I got to thank Dr. Shantanu, who is the mastermind behind this program easily, and Dr. Manika, other members of the faculty, each one put his or hands up and made this happen, and the children who volunteered to recite even at short notice. So if I do not thank them, I'm sure that's not going to be befitting of me. Thank you so much, children, Akal University, and all those that worked hard to make this happen. And this is one of the most contemporary programs we could ever have had. And thank you, Dr. Shantanu. Thank you, Professor, both the professors. So
may I add?
Yeah, you are going to add.
Add something to this. So to your excellent exposition of the vote of thanks, I would like to also thank wholeheartedly our dedicated team of the IT professionals, the IT group, which has been giving us support for making this program a success.
How can people be interested in such nonsense? Exactly, sir. Exactly. When you are not even you may be interested in human being each other. How can you be interested in such nonsense talks? Another thing is how will people need to talk whatever in such a formal way?
We lost connection, Dr. Shantanu.
No, I think.
Yeah, we can. You can carry on, sir.
It's time to all good things come to an end. But I don't want to end this, but we do have our times, so we actually overshot by almost half an hour. My idea was to finish this within an hour or maybe 75 minutes, so we are almost into 2 hours. So that speaks of the kind of intensity of the program and the interest with which all the participants and the speakers, they came. And I thank wholeheartedly both the Professor Himadri and Professor Nishat, who at such short notice, so I spoke to them maybe 2 weeks ago, just after the announcement of the prize, and they readily said yes. So let us celebrate that willingness and readiness of people who would like to bring joy to us through the poetry of Louise Glück. Thank you very much. Thanks to Dr. Anil also to moderate this program, and thanks to all the students and the audience as well. Thanks. The certificates of participation will be sent to you by email. Those who have joined as part of who have given the feedback. So if you want that certificate of participation, so please write to us, and you can receive them in your email very soon. Give us a week for you to receive them. Thank you very much. End.